Greetings, this is Greg. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk is commonly thought of as a plane that was mediocre at best and generally inferior to other contemporary fighters. This sentiment is even mentioned in the plane's 1943 pilot manual. I'm paraphrasing here, but the manual says, if you have been assigned a P-40, we know you're disappointed, we have better airplanes, but make the best of it until you get into something better. The truth is, when we look back at the plane objectively, and with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, we can see that within certain limitations it was a very capable fighter. Furthermore, it was successful in theaters where more glamorous and famous fighters failed. However, that's a subject for another video. In this episode, I really want to focus on the engine variations, not the operational history of the airplane. The Curtiss P-40s were built with two significantly different engines. Most of them had the Allison V-12, but there were a couple versions that left the factory with the Packard-built Merlin engine. In this video, I want to discuss the reason for building the plane with two different engines and discuss the effects on performance. The Allison V-1710 and Merlin V-1650 are very similar engines. They are both liquid-cooled V-12s with 4 valves per cylinder, and both feature sodium-filled exhaust valves. Every now and then I hear someone say that the Allison was a copy of the Merlin, but that's not really true. In fact, the Allison first ran in 1930. The U.S. Army Air Corps purchased their first example in December of 32. The Rolls-Royce Merlin didn't have its first run until October of 33. Now, I wouldn't say that either engine is a copy of the other. The similarities are there just because both design teams were working during the same era with the same technology and largely with data from the same sources. In the US, NACA was doing a lot of testing and experimenting with piston engines, and they were publishing the data, and most other nations had access to that. Over in England, Ricardo was doing similar work and even published a book, which is the High-Speed Internal Combustion Engine. He published this in the 1920s, the first edition. I think that it's likely that both design teams were looking at both of these sources as well as others. Ricardo's book became the Bible of piston engine design. I have put it on my Patreon page so my supporters can easily find and download it. Obviously, it's out of copyright, so I can do that. Now, if you're interested in high-performance piston engines, aircraft or automobiles, or engineering in general, I think you'll find Ricardo's book very interesting. Comparing the Allison to the Merlin, externally the Allison is a little bit smaller in every dimension, and in the critical height and width measurements it's nominally about 2 inches smaller, thus allowing for less frontal area, so that's a meaningful advantage. The Allison is also a bit lighter, but not much. The exact amount is hard to nail down because of the different ways they published engine weights back then. But a P-40 with a Merlin engine has an empty weight about 150 pounds more than an equivalent Allison-powered P-40. Again, those are empty weights. Now at combat weights, so with equivalent fuel and ammunition loads, the Merlin-powered variants were about 50 to 100 pounds heavier. So it seems that a single-stage Merlin, as installed in a P-40 with oil and coolant, adds about 100 pounds to the airplane as compared with the Allison. Peak horsepower numbers are pretty close as well. We can compare the Allison-powered P-40E with the Merlin-powered P-40F. The F is a slightly later model than the E, of course, but they're certainly close enough, and there's never a perfect apples-to-apples comparison with this stuff. In any case, the E and the F models are darn close. Now, the Allison put out 1,475 horsepower at war emergency power versus 1,300 for the Merlin. So it would seem that the Allison has the edge there. However, at military power, which is the normal maximum, the Merlin comes out slightly ahead with 1,240 to the Allison's 1,150. So far, it sounds like maybe the Allison has the advantage over the Merlin. It has fewer parts, it's smaller, a little bit lighter, and has more power when at the war emergency setting. So it may sound as if the Allison is superior, but that's not really the case. As with so many other things relating to World War II aircraft engines, The devil is in the details, and these basic specifications don't really show the Merlin's chief advantage. I want to mention the issue of complexity. It's easy to just assume that complexity is automatically a bad thing, and the Merlin's more complex than the Allison, so that's automatically a drawback. But that's not really the case. Rolls-Royce has a long history of making complex engines work really well. The Rolls-Royce Eagle was a World War I aero engine that came out in 1915. It had a parts count at least 50% higher than other aero engines at the time, yet according to Ricardo would run far longer between overhauls. Ricardo points out that it's possible to build a piston engine with only 7 parts, excluding fasteners, meaning the nuts, bolts, studs, etc. Now, if such a design based entirely on simplicity was superior, we would see most engines being built that way, but of course that's not the case. Fewer parts might make the engine less expensive to build, but maybe not, and in any case, it doesn't automatically mean you have a superior engine. Of course, fewer parts will simplify logistical issues, and we'll come back to that. Now, what about the Merlin's extra size and weight? Well, those numbers are pretty small and are offset, and to some extent caused by, the Merlin's big advantage as used in the P-40s, which was its dual-speed supercharger drive. Now keep in mind, we are talking about the earlier Merlins here, not the later dual-stage, dual-speed intercooled and aftercooled Merlins as used in the P-51 Mustang. The P-40's Merlin was a single-stage supercharger with dual speeds. It's much like what was used in some earlier Spitfires and earlier Mosquitoes. The dual speed setup allows the Merlin to make its rated power through a wider range of altitudes than the Allison, and that's its chief advantage. Now let's take a look at the maximum level flight speed of the P-40E. This was a common Allison-powered 1941 variant and was essentially identical to the British version, which was called the Kitty Hawk 1. I made this chart from original source documents, and I'll put those documents, the originals, at the end of this video. The originals are hard to read, and it's very hard to do side-by-side comparisons. So while the chart I made isn't perfect, I promise you it's darn close, probably within about 3 miles an hour of the originals at any given point, and it's much easier to read. So this is a P-40E at military power. That means 44.2 inches of manifold pressure, and it's putting out 1,150 horsepower. It can run this power setting for 15 minutes. It maintains that 1,150 horsepower, more or less, all the way up to about 12,000 feet. Thus, the airspeed, the maximum airspeed at that power setting, keeps increasing up to that point because air resistance is going down, but power is staying about the same. Now from that point up, power decreases and speed starts to suffer. The Allison supercharger is simply out of breath, and there's no second speed to engage to help it out there. This is the primary reason the Allison-powered P-40Es were only combat effective down below around 12,000 feet. This makes the P-40 somewhat useless for certain missions. It couldn't escort US B-17s or B-24s. Those 4-engine bombers with their turbo supercharging systems could cruise pretty fast at but 25,000 feet, well outside of the P-40's effective operating envelope. However, the U.S. Army Air Force wasn't too concerned about that, as they had the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt on the way to fulfill any high-altitude roles. Over in the Pacific and in the China-Burma-India theaters, most combat was taking place below 15,000 feet, so the P-40 was right in its element there. The same could be said for the Eastern Front in Europe, where the Soviets flew Lend-Lease P-40s, although they preferred the P-39 era Cobra, but that's another story. The point is that in all of these theaters, the lack of a second supercharger speed wasn't a big drawback. The U.S. also had some success with the P-40 in the Mediterranean theater, although there the P-38 Lightnings were preferred because the German planes could sometimes fly up pretty high. So adding improved high-altitude capability to the P-40 just wasn't very high on the U.S. Army Air Force priority list, because in the theaters where they were using it heavily, it didn't need it, and in cases where they did, they had other options. However, for one Lend-Lease customer, high altitude performance was a bit of a priority. The British flew P-40s, their Kitty Hawk 1s, which again are essentially P-40Es, were outclassed by the German 109Fs, especially up high. So they wanted P-40s with two-speed supercharged Packard Merlins, both to improve their chances against the contemporary German fighters and to simplify their logistics, as Merlins were commonly used in many British aircraft types at the time. Thus, Curtiss built some P-40s with Merlins. For the U.S. Army Air Force, these versions, the initial ones with Merlins, were designated P-40Fs. The British called them Kitty Hawk 2s. Let's see what its speed graph looks like. The blue line is for the Merlin-powered P-40F. It's running at combat power, which isn't directly comparable to the Allison's combat power rating, which is shown in black, because the Merlin is limited to only 5 minutes at this setting, the Allison 15 minutes. So if both planes were at 10,000 feet, the Merlin-powered plane would be about 10 miles per hour faster. However, in 5 minutes, it'll have to throttle back to max continuous, at which point the Allison-powered plane will be slightly faster for the next 10 minutes. All in all, down below 12,000 feet, these two planes are pretty close in terms of maximum speeds. The real difference is above 15,000 feet, where the P-40F can shift its supercharger into high speed, and this gives it a pretty decent performance advantage up to about 20,000 feet, where it has a 30 mile per hour speed advantage over the P-40E. There were two versions of the P-40 with the Merlin engine. They were the F and also the later L model, and there's very little performance data out there for the L model, but the L was essentially an F but lightened up via, well, mostly via equipment deletion. There are various L subtypes, but generally speaking, as compared with an F model, the L had the machine gun count reduced from 6 to 4, along with less ammunition per gun, less internal fuel, less armor plating. There were also minor improvements to various L model subtypes, like electric trim, better lighting, and so on. Now, the U.S. Army Air Force did operate the Merlin-powered F and L model P-40s. However, during the war, many of them were converted to Allison power. These F and L models that are converted to Allison power were called P-40 R1s and R2s, respectively. Of course, we have to ask, why did they go through the trouble to convert Merlin-powered P-40s to Allison power? Well, the only primary source I have that addresses this question is from the 1943 Pilot Training Manual, which says that this conversion was done, quote, for standardization purposes, unquote. I did put various P-40 manuals, including this one, into the Patreon section. Details of this are in the video description. Patreon members get early access to many of my videos, and they got early access to this one, and they get access to a large library of aviation technical publications, pilot manuals, and more, which I'm adding to all the time. Now, regarding those P-40R models, I see these conversions of the Merlin-powered P-40Fs and Ls to Allison power as a combination of two things, logistics and operational needs. On the logistical side, there were a lot of P-40s. The U.S. had them scattered all over the world, and distributing parts to remote islands in the Pacific is a lot of trouble. Having to do it for two different engines used on the same type of airplane is going to cause supply and logistical headaches. On the operational side of things, you would have to have mechanics trained on both types of engines and sets of tools for both types of engines on site where the planes are going to be maintained. And in terms of aircraft performance, at lower altitudes, the two planes aren't very far apart, and in some cases the Allisons have the advantage, which I'll talk more about in a moment. The U.S. Army Air Force didn't really feel the need for a high-altitude P-40. Again, they already had the 38 and the 47, which was in development at this point, which could be used in that role. Now, you might think the manufacturer Curtiss would have wanted to build a high-altitude version, but they didn't. Instead, they were focused on a new design, the P-60, which never made it into production. So there was no real push in the U.S., either from the military or from Curtiss, for a high-altitude engine in the P-40, thus with no real need for it, and the logistical headaches of trying to run two different engines on the same type, the U.S. Army Air Force pretty heavily favored the Allisons. And there were other issues as well. Packard was trying very hard to meet the demand for Merlins. Not only was it being used in the P-51B and subsequent Mustangs, a lot of people don't realize that the Packard Merlins were also used in Spitfires, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes, well before it was put into the P-51B. So Packard had their hands full, and using Allisons in the P-40s helped to lighten the demand for Merlins where they were more badly needed. An interesting side note is that the P-40 manufacturer was the Curtiss Airplane Division of the Curtiss-Wright Corporation. That corporation was the result of the merger between the companies that were founded by former competitors, in fact I would say even former adversaries, Glenn Curtiss and of course the Wright brothers. What I find odd is that all the airplanes made by Curtiss-Wright are called Curtiss airplanes, like the Curtiss P-40. And the engines they built were called Wrights, like the Wright R2600. It seems odd to me because prior to the merger, Curtiss was more known for engines and Wright more so for airplanes. So someone back then made a conscious decision to go against the grain and call the airplanes Curtiss and the engines Wrights. I'm sure there was a reason for this, probably something to do with marketing, but I've never been able to find anything on this particular subject. Back to our engines. I mentioned when comparing the versions installed into the P-40s, the Allison had some advantages over the Merlin, and the big one is that when the engines are run at war emergency power and at low altitude, the Allison simply makes more power. At 56 inches of manifold pressure and 3,000 RPM, it puts out 1475 horsepower in the P-40E. The Merlin engine in the P-40F at war emergency power puts out 1,300, so 175 horsepower less, and it's a little bit heavier. Unfortunately, there are no tests I can find for either of these variants at war emergency power. All the tests seem to be at military power, so let's look at the military power chart again. At sea level with both planes at military power, the Merlin has about 100 more horsepower, which puts it ahead but not much. That's about 5 miles per hour, and remember that it's limited to 5 minutes at this setting versus the Allison's 15-minute limitation. I can take a pretty good guess at how they're going to look at war emergency power based on the data we have from various other models. In other words, there are tests of other models at war emergency power, just not of the E and the F. So I use dashed lines here, and I promise you this is darn close to reality. The Allison-powered E model at war emergency power should be about on par with the Merlin-powered F model, more or less up to about 7,500 feet. It's a bit faster below 4,000, a bit slower above. Considering that the U.S. Army Air Force operated the P-40 mostly below 12,000 feet, and a lot of the combat was down even lower, I think you can understand why they didn't think the Merlin engine was worth the effort on this airframe. It should be pointed out that at sea level, a P-40E at war emergency power is about equal in speed to Germany's 109F with the famous DB601N engine, which was arguably the best fighter in the world in 1941, certainly the best Axis fighter in the world. The next thing to consider that seems to favor the Allison is the actual maximum power levels that pilots were using. While the P-40E's official war emergency power rating in the pilot's manual was 1,475 horsepower, that was at 56 inches manifold pressure, 3,000 RPM. The actual usage was quite a bit higher. At some point prior to the end of 1942, I don't have an exact date, but I know it was before the end of 42, Allison agreed to increase the power levels to 60 inches at 3,000 RPM. That gave the P-40Es 1,570 horsepower. Furthermore, pilots and mechanics were pushing the Allison even harder. Over in the Middle East, faced with very serious Axis opposition, pilots were operating P-40s at 66 inches and 3,000 RPM for 1,745 horsepower at sea level. It could hold that manifold pressure usually up to about 2,000 feet, at which point the throttle would be fully open, giving the plane 1,775 horsepower. That is a lot in a P-40. It's too bad that there's no official data for the plane's performance at these higher power settings, because this probably puts its low altitude speed on par or faster than any other fighter in theater in 1942. It's possible that they could get that 1,775 horsepower up to an even higher altitude than 2,000 feet. Not much higher, but a little bit higher. And that required either serious ram air, meaning you could do it once the airspeed was really high, maybe as you come out of a dive or something. Or it could be done via over-revving the engine, because a little more engine RPM translates into a lot more supercharger RPM due to the supercharger's gear drive ratio. Now, as far as I know, there are no tests of a P-40 at these increased power levels, not even at the officially authorized level of 1,570 horsepower, which is really unfortunate. Meanwhile, over in Australia, and I just want to mention that the Royal Australian Air Force did some pretty wild stuff in World War II, and it's underrepresented in World War II historical videos and books. Anyway, these guys were pushing their P-40s to 70 inches of manifold pressure for prolonged periods of time, giving them 1,780 horsepower at sea level. All of these numbers, by the way, are according to Allison's dyno when they tested them at these numbers. Now, the P-40 could not maintain that 70 inches at any altitude above sea level without very serious ram effect from speed or over revving, and I suspect the Australians were doing both. By the way, when I say sea level, for the newer viewers here that maybe haven't watched some older videos and fully understand this stuff, I'm talking about density altitude. It doesn't mean the airplane is actually touching the water. In any case, though, it's darn low, usually within 1,000 feet of the ground. From all indications I have, the Allison V-12s took this abuse pretty well. I suspect it shortened the engine life a bit, but in 1942, warplanes were being replaced very quickly, so I don't think that shortening the engine life was much of an issue. I should mention that there are secondary sources regarding the Soviets pushing their Allisons in the P-39s and P-40s to similar levels, but it seems they didn't have the reliability from the P-40. I may cover the Soviet uses of these planes another time. It's really a totally different ball of wax and requires a separate video. So the highest official power level from Allison in the P-40 was 1570, but we know they ran up to about 1770 and a little more in actual use. I could make a chart for these power levels using the plane's known drag and propeller efficiency numbers. We have all the data to do that, but that would be another video, and those types of videos don't do very well because they get very mathy. It doesn't mean I won't do it, it just means it's not really high on my list of things to do. The final P-40 was the N model, N as in November. The N had a number of changes. It was lighter than the earlier Allison-powered models, about 100 pounds lighter, so not a huge amount. Its Allison engine was revised. The main difference was a different supercharger drive ratio, which sacrificed a little bit of power at low altitudes for a little bit more power from about 7,000 feet on up. It had various other small improvements to make this final P-40 the best performing model among the P-40 line. The N models first appeared in early 1943 and were the most produced model of P-40. In spite of this, we only have one U.S. test with the plane at war emergency power, so I'll add it to our graph along with it at combat power in purple. The purple line shows the P-40N1 at military power, which is about 44 inches of manifold pressure. It's the same power setting as in the older E model. With the new supercharger drive ratio, it doesn't run out of breath until about 17,000 feet. At that point, it still has 44 inches of manifold pressure and can do 371 miles per hour. At military power, the P-40N1 is faster than the E model, which is to be expected, but it's also faster than the two-speed Merlin-powered P-40s at most altitudes below 17,000. Now, in fairness to the Merlin, this is largely because the N model and its Allison simply had a little bit more development at the specific point in time when these variants of P-40s were built. In other words, we're looking at an early 1943 Allison variant versus a mid-1942 Merlin variant. I don't have exact dates for the introduction of these models, by the way, but the earliest U.S. Army Air Force test of a P-40F that I can find is from July of 42. The earliest test I can find of a P-40N is from January 43, and the earliest representations of the airplanes in combat are a few months after each date. So The planes are nominally about 6-7 months apart. When running at war emergency power, the P-40N1 could reach 378 miles per hour at 10,500 feet. That's pretty good by 1943 standards. For comparison, it's faster at that altitude than an early Spitfire Mark 9 or an early 109G. It's within 5 miles an hour of a P-47 Thunderbolt-10 when it's running its water methanol injection. When you consider that the P-40 could outturn either the P-47 or the P-51, and without any problem, it's clear that in 1943, the P-40N was a very competitive fighter plane when below 12,000 feet. A few more things about this chart. The green circles are the actual data points for the P-40N from the U.S. testing. I had to fill in the other points to create the lines. I'm sure they're very close to reality. Sadly, there is not a lot of test data out there on the P-40N models. I think that by the time 1943 rolled around, the U.S. Army Air Force was far more concerned about other things. It should be pointed out that these tests I'm using for all of these airplanes, the E model, F model, and N, are all at the faster ends of the various tests I could find. A lot of times, early tests show lower numbers because often the early planes have some sort of teething issue they have to work out, overheating or something they didn't realize was causing extra drag or whatever. So all these tests were of good airplanes and represent the best examples of each variant. As Curtiss had decent production quality, I do suspect that these tests are representative of typical production airplanes of the various models. So that's about all I have for this episode. There are a few other things I want to talk about, so stick around if you're interested. You may have noticed I used footage from Enigma's IL-2 flying. He has a channel here on YouTube and was kind enough to send me this footage, so please check out his channel. On the personal side, I have switched from the IL-2 simulation to Digital Combat Simulator, aka DCS. Now, IL-2 is a fine sim. It really is. But DCS is better for me. And I only have time for one. DCS is not only the more realistic sim, it's much more realistic. That's not to say that DCS doesn't have its faults. It does, and some of them really bother me. But when the ledger is balanced, DCS comes out ahead for me and my personal needs and desires in a flight sim. I'm flying 3 airplanes in DCS, the FW-190 Dora 9, the MiG-19, and the F-14A. I'm pretty proficient in the Dora and the Tomcat. I have a ways to go here in the MiG. Enigma has created a server centered on the Cold War, so it's a great place to go into battle with F-5s, MiG-21s, and other mid-Cold War era airplanes. I'm hoping that DCS is going to add the F-4 Phantom and the F-8 Crusader. I haven't seen any sign of that yet, but maybe. In any case, Enigma server is very good, and it's a great place to fly these airplanes. He put quite a bit of work into it, and it shows. So if you're interested in that sort of online flying, you might want to check it out. I know I'll be there soon in my MiG-19, and also hopefully in the F-14A. That's all I have for now. Goodbye, everyone, and have a great day.